Hi, Professor Pinto. I hope you're doing well. The topic and title of my essay is The Stark Knight, a psychoanalysis and comparison of moral philosophies between Bruce Wayne and Tony Stark. Superheroes are the pillars of greatness. They represent the unconscious desires or wishes of the average person. Ironically, two of the most famous superheroes are the ones who do not have any super abilities, Iron Man and Batman. Both of these characters are quite similar when compared at face value. Bruce and Tony are both playboy billionaire entrepreneurs who run companies handed down by their fathers, but they are men who have independently developed themselves over time. However, their development did not happen overnight. Bruce and Tony each underwent their own trials and tribulations to become the men they are today. Tony Stark and Bruce Wayne are foils for each other. They both experience devastating early trauma. They both inherit fortunes, business, power, privilege, and yet they diverge at some point. Freudian analysis can be used to explore the role of trauma and its effects on the development of a moral framework in intimate relationships. Trauma is the key factor that defines the psyches of Bruce Wayne and Tony Stark. Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, states the following about trauma. We describe as traumatic any excitations from outside which are powerful enough to break through the protective shield of the mind. That is, a person's mind is usually able to keep itself protected with what Freud describes as a barrier against stimuli. However, once this barrier is penetrated, the mind is flooded with stimuli that it cannot control. Freud correlates an immature ego as being more susceptible to trauma. Thus, a child is more likely to experience trauma from a particular event. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a result of experiencing trauma such as abandonment. Bruce develops PTSD from a very young age. The singular event of watching his parents die in front of him correlates to his becoming a superhero. Tony, however, suffers from abandonment issues from lack of respect from his parents, primarily his father. This abandonment is his driving force for becoming a brilliant militaristic entrepreneur just like his father. Tony also has to deal with PTSD later on in his life, after he almost sacrifices himself by going into outer space in Joss Whedon's film The Avengers. Bruce and Tony's character transformations are due to the traumatic events surrounding their lives when they were younger, causing both Tony and Bruce to suffer from issues of abandonment and PTSD, respectively. And yet, while these events are terrible, Bruce and Tony would not be the people that they have developed into had they not experienced this trauma. In contemporary political theory, Matthew H. Bowker claims injury is a good teacher because it teaches us that injury is inevitable, and we must be endured by learning to see our bad experiences as good. We do so by understanding ourselves to be the only passive recipients of good experiences that can only happen to us. If we wish them, will them, design them, or create them, then we cannot experience them fully, cannot profit from their wisdom. Without these bad experiences, we are naive and empty. Therefore, bad experiences are really good. Bowker is conveying that the trauma that Tony and Bruce experienced was essential for their developing them into the heroes that they are today. As stated before, Tony's abandonment by his parents is what formed him into who he is today. The same argument can be made for Bruce, who started slowly growing into his Batman persona after his parents were shot in the alley. Without these experiences, both Tony and Bruce may have grown to be naive and empty, as Bowker stated, and the world would not have seen the existence of Iron Man and Batman. Essentially, Tony and Bruce have turned their bad experiences into positive outcomes. However, they are being influenced by their id, ego, and superego. In Jon Favreau's Iron Man and Christopher Nolan's film Batman Begins, the audience sees that for both Tony and Bruce, traumatic events ultimately become the good teacher, as Bowker states. Tony goes from being a narcissist who embraces the nickname Merchant of Death to someone who cannot even look at his own reflection. According to Freud's psychoanalytic theory of the id, ego, and superego, the id, which consists of the dark, inaccessible part of our personality, is conceptualized in two ways: unconscious instinctual urges and repression. At the beginning of Iron Man, Tony exemplifies the former definition. the dark, inaccessible part of our personality that makes us act on our own impulses. After Yinsen sacrifices himself to keep Tony alive, Tony's ego comes into play. Freud alleges in his work, New Introductory Lectures in Psychoanalysis, evident in each individual there is a coherent organization of mental processes, and we call this his ego. It is to this ego that consciousness is attached. The ego controls the approaches to motility. It is the mental agency which supervises all its own constituent processes. Essentially, Tony comes to a realization through his ego that he must use his intelligence for good rather than destruction. The death of Yinsen sparks this transition. Tony's ego is overriding the desires of its id, and that the ego consciously supervises the id. Tony is no longer following his unconscious instinctual urges, but rather has found a new sense of purpose that he has consciously decided to pursue. At the end of the first Avengers film, when Tony is shot into space and sacrifices himself for the greater good, he understandably exhibits post-traumatic stress disorder and existential anxiety. The character who showed such great post-traumatic growth after a horrific experience at the start of Iron Man demonstrates a very different pattern when the audience sees him again at the start of Iron Man 3. Whereas coping with the abduction by terrorists in his origin story required Tony to muster the determination to survive, protecting New York from a nuclear weapon in the Avengers means accepting his own demise in a way that he has never done before. His ego has been so damaged that he relives the event again and again. This trauma is particularly evident in the scene in Iron Man 3 when a child shows Tony a drawing of him flying into space. Tony immediately starts blacking out and breathing heavily, essentially having a panic attack. He runs out the door only to collapse into his suit and onto the floor. This scenario happens multiple times during the film. On the other hand, in accordance with Freud's psychoanalytic theory, Bruce's fear of bats leads him to lose his parents as he was frightened by the portrayals of bat-like demons in the opera performance in Gotham City that he went to see with his parents, where they were confronted by an armed mugger who shot and killed them. A young Bruce learned to control his feelings and had to deal with the circumstances in a peaceful way. Bruce, the persona who appears to his family and friends, represents the id because he wants and needs immediate gratification. Bruce, the one who appears in public, represents a superego because his acting shows that he is conscious of his behavior. In public, Bruce takes over his father's businesses and works hard to rebuild the business, similar to how it was in the past when his father was alive. At this stage, he is in sublimation according to Freudian terms, which means that he is turning a desire into something more noble. Bruce is in a stage of repression, which is forcing his conscious memories into the unconscious in order to forget about trauma. Batman represents the id because Bruce's character as the Batman is instinctual, impulsive, and has chaotic thoughts due to trauma and the feeling of abandonment from witnessing his parents' deaths. Batman is a psychological defense of Bruce. The anger and the revenge which Bruce had to get from the murder of his parents, he got through as Batman. Bruce uses the Freudian term defense mechanism when he is Batman because it helps him forget the things that happened in the past. In other words, has a fixation on his parents' death. This is reinforcement of the id, for if the purpose of the defense or the underlying impulse were to become conscious, the defense no longer would serve its concealing function, and so is likely to be abandoned. In other words, Batman is just the result of Bruce's repression, and if that repression were to escape, he would no longer be Batman. The trauma Bruce and Tony have endured have also influences their moral judgment. In a study published in the Journal of Affective Disorders, Emmett M. Larson, a clinical psychologist, states higher ratings of physical neglect were significantly associated with higher ratings of acceptability, a utilitarian tendency across dilemma types, and a similar pattern was observed at the trend level for experiences of emotional neglect. As stated before, Tony's biggest issue and the catalyst for his development is abandonment. Therefore, the probability is high that Tony views the world as utilitarian because of his parents' abandonment. This perspective comes from his superego, which is commonly seen as a set of beliefs one holds. His utilitarian stance juxtaposes the deontological stance of Bruce, meaning Bruce follows a set of codes or rules, that is, no guns and no killing. Batman's no-kill policy also stems from the PTSD he suffers from his parents' death. The Joker. Batman's greatest foe is always causing havoc and taking advantage of the fact that he knows that Batman will not kill him. In his book, Batman and Philosophy, The Dark Night of the Soul, Mark White explains why Batman refuses to kill the Joker, essentially stating that to deontologists, the end never justifies the means, but rather the means must be justifiable on their own merits. So the argument that killing the Joker would prevent future killings is irrelevant. The only factor in Batman's philosophy that is relevant is that killing is wrong, period. However, Tony would kill the Joker in a heartbeat if given the opportunity, because he knows that by this act he would be saving multiple lives in the long run. Batman uses his ego to keep himself in check. However, his ego is constantly fighting the urges of his id and superego. In other words, his deontological beliefs, which seem to be in conflict with each other. He wants to kill the Joker, but he has enough self-control not to do so. Iron Man's superego, in other words, his utilitarian beliefs, enable him to avoid this type of thinking and behavior, so he does not have to deal with this internal conflict at all. Despite the differences they share, Batman and Iron Man both become father figures due to the similarities they share in their traumas. Since they both lost their parents at a young age and have never fully mourned the death of their respective parents, both become surrogate father types. Bruce mentors adolescent boys while Tony does the same with Peter Parker. With that said, there are two main reasons that Bruce and Tony take up sidekicks. The first reason would be that since they are abandoned as children, they feel distant from others. But when they find the person they like, they keep that person close. Bruce will take in a young boy like Dick Grayson or Jason Todd because they remind him of himself. The same is true for the relationship between Tony and Peter. Based on virtue ethics, they seem to ignore their utilitarian and deontological beliefs in order to make the father-son relationship work. All in all, Bruce Wayne and Tony Stark's analogous character identities are actually quite different from one another because of the traumatic events that have formed who they are, the moral philosophical beliefs they respectively hold, and the father-son relationships both characters take on. They both exemplify the psychoanalytic ideas of the id, ego, and superego, each of which have helped form their philosophical beliefs. They have both grown from their experiences, and they both have a hidden desire to be a father figure. Overall, one can say that through psychoanalytic analysis, the differences of Bruce and Tony are brought to life. Thank you. In an effort to disguise it from the conscious mind.